Ladies, gentlemen, am I often forgotten, but certainly not by me. Champions, rings, welcome to the channel, and welcome to the Melee edition of my RuneScape 3 DPS guide. In this guide, I'll be specifically talking about my ability prioritizations and personal rotations, not so much the actual best ones out there. I think they're close enough for me, and I have some pretty good rotations. However, I will never claim to be the best meleeer in this game, and I'm simply just going to show my approach to how I tackle melee damage. I will also be covering my rotations for certain levels of gear, be it if you just started out with some T85s or T90s, all the way up until best in slots. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this DPS guide. Alrighty, so for this guide, I decided to take more of a live approach to this with a on-screen visual, rather than doing a bunch of slides and other things. Also, in the upper left-hand corner, I have a program to show my keyboard inputs, as well as a webcam showing the keyboard. It's something I typically do on live streams, but if it's another visual that can help someone out, then so be it. Let's go ahead and talk about my gear setup, though, really quick. So for my gear setup, as far as I can tell, this is best in slot melee. There's probably something I'm missing here, but everything I can think of is accounted for, being that I have SWH, a ZGS, and EZK all in an EOF, so everything is getting T95 damage values. I have an EZK for a swap. I also have the new whip, spikes and helmet that help with adrenaline. They give a lot of adren. And you may be looking at all this and saying to yourself, wow, I don't have nearly all this gear. And trust me, you don't need all this gear to do good damage at most bosses. The swords themselves, or just a T92 spear, will suit you just fine. Now, how I have this set up is down in the bottom right here, these are my thumb buttons, and this is how I control what swaps I'm doing. And I have a dual wield bar, and I have a two-hand bar. And I would recommend doing this just so you can keep specific abilities with the weapon that you're using. So things like Decimate and Cleave, Cleave is pointless on a dual wield bar because you can't use it with dual wield weapons. So branching off of the idea of having a separate bar for dual wield and two-hander, that's where I want to lead into talking about what basic abilities I do. So what I do is I use 188s as often as possible, and then when they're off cooldown, or on cooldown I should say, then I substitute in other abilities and kind of chain different ones together as best as I can. So I start out with Decimate, and I have on my two-hand bar in the same slot, I have Cleave, because both of these are 188s. They're very powerful basics, and they have a good cooldown being 7 seconds. So what you can do is use Decimate into a Cleave, and then just use two basics, and then once you use the two basics, they're off cooldown again, and you can Decimate Cleave again. So the best way to think about basics with melee is you're on a 4-block rotation, and the first two will always be Decimate and Cleave, at least for as far as basics are concerned. Typically what I'll do after that is on my third ability is I'll toss Fury in there, and it's always available as a third ability. That's just something I've always done, and I'll use it to buff whatever ability I use next, such as something like Havoc. Or if sometimes what I'll do is I'll Dismember and then Fury, so the Fury crit chance buff is applied to Decimate for slot 3 and 4 of that small basic rotation. That's generally what I'm always doing. I'm sure there is a highly optimized version of this, however, this is how I've always done it. And also with things like Gloves of Passage, if you use Havoc, you can then put a bleed on, and it does a bleed. There we go. A little bit of lag or something, but the bleed will do more damage with the Havoc buff present. So to quickly sum up the basics that I'm using once again, I always use Decimate and Cleave as the first two abilities in a 4-ability kind of block, if that makes sense. And I typically try and put Fury before something like Sever. I'll try and combo Havoc with Dismember, And if Dismember, say, is off cooldown, or Havoc's off cooldown, but Dismember is up for whatever reason, then I'll make Fury the 4th one before Decimate, or just kind of use whatever's off cooldown. Now, other abilities on this bar, you'll notice Slice is on here. I almost never use Slice. It's just for Adren building and saving better abilities when I'm Adren building, say for a soft cap like phase 4 Solak or something. I just use it as an Adren building ability so I can save the better ones for actually doing damage on the boss when he's attackable. Other abilities to keep in mind, I'll talk about Barge when we get into ultimate rotations. And Backhand is a good basic if flanking is available for the boss you're doing. Typically, I'm doing a lot of solo content, so I don't use Backhand all too much. There are instances where you can walk under flank, however, I've personally found that to be a lot of effort at most solo encounters, so Backhand with flank, it is a very strong, very good ability. However, personally, I don't use it too much. So now that we've covered basic abilities, I'm going to go ahead and cover my Zerk rotations, and that's going to include thresholds because, honestly, I don't use thresholds by themselves. I usually save thresholds for some type of buff, whether that's a easy case spec, and I just need to get extra damage out while doing bleeds, or a ZGS spec, and I want to utilize thresholds there because they're buffed. But typically I don't use Assault, Destroy, Greater Flurry, or Hurricane on their own. I typically save them for either a weapon spec or a Zerk. So my standard Zerk rotation would look something like this. This is applicable from anything with just tier 85 dual wield all the way up till pretty much best in slot. However, with the tier 92 whip, things change a little bit. However, just a standard baseline Zerk rotation would look something like this, where I would Zerk with apot, and then Barge, double basic, bleed Assault, and go into a Destroy. Now here, I happen to have enough Adrenaline to then immediately Hurricane, and then hit a few more basic abilities, and then sometimes I'll go for a 2-hit Flurry, other times I don't. And that's pretty much my Zerk rotation over with. So the point of Berserk is to get as many thresholds out as you can as a general idea. Being that Zerk is only, it only lasts 20 seconds, so you don't have a whole lot of time to really get out a bunch of abilities. So utilizing things like Adrenaline Renewal or Adrenaline Potions, very, very handy for getting out a good Zerk rotation. And I will almost always bleed Assault into a Destroy. However, what I started doing with the whip specifically is bleeding Destroy with the Lang Sword on, and then swapping to the whip and then using Assault afterwards. That way the cooldown for Hurricane is still available. However, that's for more advanced situations. If you're just looking for a standard Zerk, bleed Assault, Destroy, get out a Hurricane, and maybe a 3-hit Flurry, and you'll be set. Also, a quick note on the relics I'm using. I do use COE with melee, mostly because I don't melee too often, and I'm usually using magic or range, so I just keep this one on because it's kind of expensive to switch, and it's honestly nice to have a 40% overpower and Zerk adrenaline and whatnot. So I usually use that with Fury of the Small, and you can toss in whatever you want, Death Ward or something else. Zerk Fury is a really good melee relic. However, again, I'm usually just kind of lazy when it comes to doing melee stuff, so I typically just keep these relics. So keep that in mind for the adrenaline usage you see when I'm going through these rotations. So real quickly before I move on into ZGS and other weapon spec based rotations, I wanted to quickly touch on Overpower and how I personally utilize it. I will use it at the end of a weapon spec typically, or if I get a relentless proc on my Berserks. So if I get a relent proc on the Zerk, I'll Barge, I always barge first, and then I would hit Overpower, and then immediately go into bleeding thresholds and doing other things of the sort. So if that happens, I'll do that. Typically, I don't use Overpower in a standard Zerk rotation. However, I'm pretty sure I could fit it in, especially considering that I'm using Conservation of Energy and would Vig swap for it. But I haven't experimented enough with Melee to truly optimize its usage inside of Zerk and inside of other weapon specs. Another quick note before we move on to weapon specs. When it comes to using Limitless Sigil, or Limitless Ability now as it's called, I typically will do the same Zerk rotations and follow the same threshold usage, regardless of if I'm using apot or Limitless. However, with Limitless, you have to be much more poignant with your threshold usage because you only have 6 seconds of duration before the effect goes away. And for those who don't know, Limitless allows you to use threshold abilities under 50% adrenaline. They still cost 15% per usual and can be affected by whichever modifiers you have applied for adren usage sake. However, you can use an assault at, say, 30%. So a typical Limitless Zerk for me would look something like this. I would Zerk with Vigor, Barge, double basic, and then go ahead and bleed Assault. Then I would go ahead and hit Hurricane, and then basic and destroy just as Limitless is wearing off. Or is about to wear off. Then from there, I just hit normal basic abilities and try and build up to then go into some type of weapon spec. So typically for Limitless, you don't have much time, so you try and get all the thresholds out during the time you have Limitless open. So on-tick Limitlessing is pretty nice. It makes it easier to get it, so all you have to do is hit whatever your Limitless keybind is with your Assault in just that order. So you hit Limitless, Assault, keybind on roughly the same tick, and go from there. And I will always try and Hurricane afterwards, or use some type of other ability that's only going to cost 3 ticks worth of time. Because if you hit Limitless and then go immediately into a Destroy, you only have to activate Destroy to start it. Limitless does not have to be active during the whole Destroy duration. So you can put something like a Channeled at the very end of Limitless, and it will continue to get the full ability out. So just keep that in mind for when using Limitless. So having a good Berserk rotation is definitely a keynote in doing good melee damage. However, Berserk has a minute cooldown, and we have to fill that other 40 seconds with abilities and other things to make up for lost time, so to speak. So what I typically use is either a ZGS or an EZK spec. Now, I have both of them in EOFs. You do not need this at all. A ZGS as a two-hander out in your inventory, perfectly fine. There is nothing wrong with it. I'm just a little bit extra and had some GP to waste. So for ZGS, I will typically build up to about somewhere in the 75-80% adrenaline range, maybe a little bit more if I get lucky on impatient procs or something like that. And then I will start a ZGS spec and go from there. Now, Dismember right now, as far as I know, it's not exactly worthwhile inside of a Berserk, although there is a lot of testing going on right now. Time of recording is April 12th, so I know that there is some testing right now for Dismember inside of Zerk, specifically in relation to the helm, spikes, and whip. However, if you don't have this set up and you're not on the bleeding edge of melee, Dismember in Zerk is not a good idea because bleed damage is not boosted by Berserk, being that Dismember or Slaughter and Tendrils, they're not boosted by it. However, inside of a ZGS, Dismember is such a strong ability with the spear that it is worthwhile to go ahead and use it inside of a ZGS rotation. Now, as far as ZGS goes, I will typically just use Destroy and Hurricane. I typically will save Assault for my Zerk, being that At most places I'm at, eventually I'll get caught off a guard and not have an assault ready for bleeding inside of a Zerk. Now, in theory, with the whip usage and bleeding destroy instead of assault, that shouldn't be an issue. However, I'm kind of old school with melee and I have not been experimenting with the new stuff, so to speak. So, for those of you out there without the whip, or you have just the whip and your T85s or whatever, then go ahead and just follow these standard things. So, ZGS, get destroy off, probably a 2 or maybe a 3 hit greater flurry. Sometimes I'll let it go out all the way, and a hurricane. Also, things like dismember and tendrils are a good idea. I'm pretty sure, as far as I can remember, all bleeds are fine to use inside of the ZGS. Slaughter, I only use on targets that are walkable, because Slaughter by itself is good, but if you walk the target, meaning you walk under it or it moves off of the tile that it was standing on when Slaughter was applied, it will do 3 times the damage. So it's a very, very strong bleed if used correctly. And the TMW Spear allowing it to go 50% longer, it just gets even more ridiculous. So as far as that's concerned, that's typically how I do ZGS. So I'll go ahead and do an example ZGS spec here real quickly. So to start it off, them attacking, I've built up my adrenaline. I'll go ahead and hit ZGS spec, and I'll try and get a 2-hand auto off and cleave, decimate, and then I go ahead and let a full destroy out. Time it with a basic, and then I'll usually hit another basic hurricane, and then go for dismember, and have it just to boost it with passage glove swap. And that's pretty much it. Sometimes I'll also get like a 2-hit flurry in there depending on adrenaline. However, it's mostly just destroy and hurricane getting boosted by that. You could also probably fit overpower in, although half the time I don't think about it too much. I haven't, like I said before, I haven't experimented too much with overpower and really how to optimize it, but I'd say inside of a ZGS, if you Vig swap for it, then for sure, overpower is a good idea. I would definitely try and go for overpower over greater flurry should you have enough adrenaline to utilize it. Alrighty, to kind of top off all of the switches, Easy K spec and how I utilize it. Easy K, as far as I know, it is still worthwhile to put it inside of a EOF, and then just use your spear, the T92 spear, something like that, as your cleave swap. Because what you can do is stall the special attack, but because melee distance, you have to be standing 1 tile away from the target. So you could just step off a tile and stall it, and then come back in, equip your spear, and then just click the target and release with dismember. And that'll allow you to get extra bleeds off on the target, because Easy K spec will do more damage the more bleeds that are on the target, and that's what builds up the stacks for Easy K spec. So dismember, slaughter, tendrils. I don't know if there's anything else that people will do. Maybe there's some like weird stuff where someone might in-gen a off-style bleed, although I don't really think that's a thing. And honestly, that's all I really do for Easy K spec. There's nothing really special with it as far as I know. And it is also, as far as melee, this is the newest thing to me, and that's all I've ever really figured out with it so far. So a quick example of what I do with Easy K spec. So just say I'm attacking the target here, I've built up my adrenaline. I'll go ahead and get off the target, stall it, equip the spear, and then release the spec with a dismember, and then go ahead and place the other bleeds on the target. And then after that, it's just a matter of using some thresholds and other things of the sort, keeping an eye on that dismember timer. Go ahead and put another dismember on, and we can go ahead and go for an overpower just because we can. And that's all I honestly really do for Easy K spec. Might toss in a couple other thresholds, waiting for Zerk cooldown, depending on what that's looking like. And that's honestly all I really do. It's a pretty easy to use spec, and it's also the newest for me, so I'm not fully sure on like an extremely optimized easy K rotation. However, this is just what I personally do with it for now. Alrighty, so I quickly just wanted to go over some final thoughts and some gear-specific rotations, depending on where you're at in your journey with Melee. So, final thoughts, Dragon Battle Axe, I always use at the Adrenaline Crystal if I'm meleeing something. If I teleport out and I'm doing like a one-kill trip, or wherever the case is, I'll DBA at Adren Crystal, and if I can get into the instance fast enough, I will also Lang Spec, just to help boost that damage a bit more. Lang Spec, I typically don't use pre-Zerk, although I imagine it's probably worthwhile if you're forced off a boss or something like that. The only place I really use it is Raksha or Terraket at ED3, because you can go well past hit cap on both of those specific encounters, so I think it's worthwhile there. But in general, if you're not forced off a boss and you're continually attacking, I don't really use it a whole lot before a Zerk. Although, it probably is worthwhile because it brings the 10k non-crit cap up to 13k, which a lot of Zerk hits from like Assault, Destroy, Hurricane will go over that 10k even if they don't crit. So it's something to experiment with and certainly find out what works for you. Speaking specifically on rotations I would use for certain gear, if all you have right now is the tier 85 version of the Lang Swords and maybe a Scythe or something, I would suggest just doing a standard Zerk rotation like shown before with apot, and then if you have limitless, go ahead and use that as your second Zerk option. And then in between, go ahead and just use some extra thresholds like you would in a ZGS spec, but without the ZGS spec, obviously. So using your Destroy, your Flurry, and Hurricane, things like that as kind of an in-between. Also, even without the Spear, the bleeds are still really good to use, especially Slaughter and Tendrils. And you could probably pick up a lunging switch for real cheap for Dismember on like one of the twin swords or something. Although I would save lunging honestly for getting a spear. It just depends on what your how much GP you have right now and what your gear is looking like. And then as you add in things like ZGS or EZK or things like that, those usually go in between berserks. So you would do a Zerk rotation, build up a little bit of adrenaline, maybe get a couple bleeds out, like the threshold bleeds or something, and then go into a ZGS spec or an EZK spec. In general, I either pick EZK or ZGS as a spec to do in between Zerks, although I have played with a couple rotations and was able to do both in between Zerks, specifically because of the whip helm and armor spikes being able to give so much adrenaline that I was able to do it. However, it was a pretty tight rotation, and I'm honestly not even sure if it's worthwhile to do because it kind of doesn't allow you to get the full usage out of either of them. EZK spec, it does allow you to get all the bleeds off because you can still use Dismember in ZGS. However, I felt that ZGS was suffering because I wasn't able to fully utilize thresholds inside of it because I'd be using it and immediately going into a Zerk, and timings are getting very, very tight in that situation. So I would pick one or the other based on what you have, and then incorporate Overpower more with those specs, and possibly into your Zerk as well, being that Overpower with the cape, it's 30-second cooldown and uses I think it's 50% adrenaline if you use it with Vigor, but then obviously if you have COE on, then it's a little bit less. It's 40%, I believe. So all depends on what your setup is. However, that's kind of my general rule of thumb for deciding what to use. Alrighty, so that was quite a long-winded video with a lot of information. If you have questions about that, or about this guide, go ahead and leave them in the comments below, and I will also leave both my Twitch and my Twitter linked in the description below. Feel free to ask questions if I'm live, or follow me on Twitter and ask me something there. ladies, gentlemen, and I did not forget about you champions rings. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this guide was able to help you out on your journey into doing some full send melee DPS. Anyway, this is Car Guy. Have a wonderful morning, evening, afternoon, nighttime, whatever it is, wherever you are, and I will see you for the next video. Peace.